The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Bella Vista, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Elena Martinez moved between tables with practiced ease, balancing a tray of steaming pasta dishes on her left hand, while her right hand clutched the order pad tucked into her apron pocket. The lunch rush was finally dying down, and her feet ached in ways they never used to. She caught her reflection in one of the gilded mirrors hanging on the restaurant's cream-colored walls. At 28, she still looked young, but there was something tired in her eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago. Her dark hair was pulled back in the tight bun the restaurant required, and her white blouse was spotless despite having served nearly 40 customers that shift. She looked like any other waitress in any other upscale restaurant in Manhattan. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. But Elena hadn't always been just a waitress. 3 years ago, she had walked different halls, the prestigious corridors of Juilliard, where every footstep echoed with promise and every practice room hummed with ambition. She'd been one of the lucky ones, a scholarship student who'd made it in on pure talent. Her piano professor had called her a natural, said she had hands that were made to create music. Back then, she practiced 8 hours a day, her fingers flying across the keys until they were sore, until the notes became as natural as breathing. She remembered the weight of acceptance in her hands when she'd opened that letter. Her mother had cried, holding Elena's face between her weathered hands and whispering prayers of gratitude in Spanish. They'd celebrated with cheap champagne and homemade tamales in their tiny apartment in Queens. It felt like every sacrifice, every double shift her mother had worked at the hospital, every time they'd chosen to fix Elena's keyboard instead of fixing the heating, had finally paid off. That was a lifetime ago. Now, Elena cleared table 7 and smiled politely at the couple who barely looked up from their phones to acknowledge her. She collected their plates, wiped down the table, and moved to the next one. This was her life now. 2 shifts a day, 6 days a week. Her hands, which used to create symphonies, now carried soup and pasta. The calluses hadn't completely faded, though. If you looked closely at her fingertips, you could still see the slight hardening from years of pressing piano keys. Bella Vista was the kind of place where people came to be seen as much as to eat. The walls were decorated with expensive paintings. The lighting was always dim and romantic, and there was a dress code for the staff that Elena found slightly ridiculous. White blouse, black skirt, hair back, minimal jewelry. The manager, Mr. Peterson, was particular about appearances. He wanted his restaurant to feel elegant, sophisticated, like old money. In the far corner of the main dining room sat the restaurant's centerpiece, or at least what Mr. Peterson called the centerpiece. A beautiful Steinway grand piano, glossy black and elegant, positioned beneath a crystal chandelier. It had been imported from Germany, or so the story went, and cost more than Elena would make in 5 years of waiting tables. But here was the cruel irony that Elena lived with every single day. Nobody played it. It sat there like a museum piece, like something too precious to touch. Sometimes wealthy diners would pose next to it for photos, their hands hovering over the keys without actually pressing down. Mr. Peterson had mentioned once that he kept it tuned twice a year, just in case a celebrity guest wanted to play. But in the 3 years Elena had worked there, she'd never heard a single note come from that piano. She walked past it dozens of times each shift. Every time she felt a small ache in her chest. It was like watching something beautiful being wasted. That piano wanted to be played. She could feel it calling to her, the same way the practice pianos at Juilliard used to call to her during breaks between classes. Sometimes, late at night after closing, when she was wiping down tables and Mr. Peterson was counting the register in his office, Elena would stop and just look at it. She'd stand there with her cleaning cloth in hand and remember the feel of keys beneath her fingers. Remember the way a difficult passage would finally click after hours of practice. Remember the applause after her junior recital, small but genuine, her mother in the front row with tears streaming down her face. She never touched it, though. That wasn't allowed. The staff had been explicitly told the piano was off limits. It was for ambiance, Mr. Peterson had explained during her training. Not for use. Elena's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out during a quiet moment and saw a text from her mother. "Just checking in, Mia. Did you eat lunch?" The message was in English, though her mother still struggled with the language sometimes. Elena smiled and quickly typed back that she was fine. She'd eat after her shift, What she didn't tell her mother was that she'd been eating less lately, trying to save money. What she didn't mention was that the medical bills were still piling up, even 3 years after her mother's surgery. What she kept to herself was the fact that she'd picked up an extra shift on her only day off because the electricity bill was due. Her mother didn't know the full cost of what Elena had sacrificed. When the call had come, during her final year at Juilliard, Elena had been in the middle of practicing Chopin. Her mother had collapsed at work. Stroke. The word had felt unreal, too heavy to be connected to her strong, vibrant mother who'd never missed a day of work in her life. Elena had rushed to the hospital still in her practice clothes and found her mother pale and confused, one side of her face drooping. The recovery had been long and expensive. Even with insurance, the bills were crushing. Physical therapy, medications, follow-up appointments, the weeks her mother couldn't work. Elena had tried to balance everything. She'd tried to stay in school, work part-time, and take care of her mother. For one semester, she almost managed it. She practiced at midnight, worked morning shifts, attended afternoon classes, then rushed to help her mother with dinner and exercises. But something had to give. It was her piano professor who'd finally sat her down and talked to her honestly. Elena was exhausted. Her playing was suffering, and she was on track to lose her scholarship if her grades didn't improve. The conversation had been kind but direct. Sometimes life demands impossible choices. Elena had withdrawn 2 months before graduation. 2 months. She'd been so close to that degree, so close to the life she'd worked toward since she was 7 years old, and had first touched a piano at her elementary school's music class. She'd told herself it was temporary. She'd go back. She'd finish. She'd find a way. That was 3 years ago. Now, as she refilled water glasses at table 12, Elena felt the weight of those 3 years. The debt hadn't shrunk the way she'd hoped. Her mother was better, thank God, but she couldn't work full-time anymore. Elena supported them both on waitress wages and the occasional cash tips from generous customers. Going back to school felt more impossible now than ever. The dream had faded from a possibility to a memory, to something she tried not to think about. The dinner shift would start in 2 hours. Elena had just enough time to grab something to eat in the back, change into a fresh blouse, and prepare herself for another evening of smiling at strangers while her feet screamed and her back ached. As she pushed through the kitchen doors with a tray of dirty dishes, Carlos, one of the line cooks, called out to her.
"Hey, Elena, you okay?"
"You look tired." "I'm fine," she said automatically. The response so practiced it didn't even require thought. "You always say that," he replied, but he was already turning back to his prep work. Elena loaded the dishes and took a moment to lean against the wall, closing her eyes. In the quiet of her mind, she could still hear music. Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Beethoven, the pieces she'd once performed flawlessly, the pieces that now only played in her memory. She opened her eyes and straightened up. There was work to do. Dreams didn't pay bills. Memories didn't put food on the table. She had 2 hours before the evening crowd arrived. Before the restaurant filled with people who'd never know that the quiet waitress serving their wine had once had different hands, a different life, a different future, and in the corner, the Steinway waited, silent and untouched, just like Elena's dreams. The Saturday evening shift started the way it always did. Elena tied a fresh apron around her waist, checked her reflection one last time to make sure her hair was perfect, and stepped out into the dining room just as the first reservation arrived. Saturdays were always busy at Bella Vista, always demanding, but the tips were better. She needed those tips. By 7 o'clock, the restaurant was nearly full. The soft chatter of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware and crystal glasses. Mr. Peterson moved between tables with his practiced smile, greeting regular customers by name and making sure everything ran smoothly. The kitchen was in full swing, and Elena had already served 3 tables their appetizers. She was refilling bread baskets when she heard the commotion at the front entrance. A man's voice, loud and authoritative, cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. "I have a reservation. The name is Ashford. Victor Ashford." Elena glanced toward the entrance and saw Mr. Peterson's entire demeanor change. His back straightened, his smile became wider, almost nervous. He was practically bowing as he greeted the new arrival. That kind of reaction only happened for 2 types of customers: Britties or people with serious money and influence. Victor Ashford was both. Elena had heard the name before, though she'd never seen him in person. Everyone in the classical music world knew who Victor Ashford was. He was the critic, the one whose reviews in the New York Times could make or break a career. She remembered her professors at Juilliard mentioning him, with a mixture of respect and fear. A good review from Ashford could launch you into stardom. A bad review could end everything before it even started. He swept into the restaurant like he owned it, and in a way he did. His presence commanded attention. He was in his late 50s, tall and lean, with silver hair combed back from a sharp face. He wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Elena made in 6 months, and there was a gold watch on his wrist that caught the light as he gestured impatiently. Behind him came 2 other people, clearly his guests for the evening. A younger man in his 30s, nervous-looking, carrying a leather portfolio, and a woman about Ashford's age, dressed in designer clothes with perfectly styled blonde hair. They followed him like attendants following royalty. Mr. Peterson personally escorted them to one of the best tables in the house, right in the center of the dining room, where everyone could see them. It was the kind of table usually reserved weeks in advance, but apparently rules didn't apply to Victor Ashford. Elena watched from a distance as Mr. Peterson fussed over them, snapping his fingers at another waiter to bring water and wine menus immediately. Then, to Elena's dismay, Mr. Peterson caught her eye and gestured her over. "Elena, you'll be taking care of Mr. Ashford's table tonight," he said quietly. But there was an edge to his voice, a warning. "Make sure everything is perfect, everything." Her stomach tightened. She understood what he meant. This wasn't just another customer. This was someone important, someone who could write a review that might mention the restaurant, someone who expected perfection and wouldn't hesitate to complain if he didn't get it. She approached the table with her best smile, her order pad ready. "Good evening. Welcome to Bella Vista. Can I start you off with something to drink?" Victor Ashford didn't even look at her. He was studying the wine list, his finger tracing down the page. "The 2015 Barolo," he said dismissively. "And make sure it's properly decanted. I don't want it sitting in the bottle." "Of course, sir," Elena replied, making a note. The woman smiled at Elena, at least acknowledging her presence. "I'll have a glass of Chardonnay, please." "Whatever you recommend." The younger man looked nervous. "Just water for me, thank you." As Elena turned to leave, Ashford's voice stopped her. "Wait, what's your name?" She turned back. "Elena, sir." He looked at her now, really looked at her, and there was something calculating in his gaze. "Elena what?" "Martinez, sir." "Ah." He said it in a way that made her heritage sound like an explanation for something. "Well, Elena Martinez, I expect excellent service tonight. I've been here before, and I know what this establishment is capable of. Don't disappoint me." There was something in his tone that made her feel small. Not the words themselves, but the way he said them. Like she was already a disappointment waiting to happen. Like she was beneath him. "I'll do my best, sir," she said evenly, maintaining her professional smile. "Your best," he repeated, and then waved her away like she was a fly. Elena walked to the bar to place the drink order, her jaw tight. Carlos had been right earlier. She was tired. But more than that, she was tired of people like this. People who treated service workers like they were invisible, like they were less than human. The evening continued, and Victor Ashford lived up to the reputation Elena had heard whispers about. He sent back his appetizer because the temperature wasn't right. He complained that his Barolo had been decanted too long, then later complained it hadn't been decanted enough. When Elena brought the main courses, he examined his plate like he was looking for evidence of a crime. But worse than his pickiness was the way he treated her. He snapped his fingers to get her attention, something that made her skin crawl. He never said please or thank you. When she was explaining the dessert menu, he interrupted her mid-sentence to talk to his companions about some concert he'd reviewed last week, leaving her standing there awkwardly until he finally waved her away again. The other diners near Ashford's table seemed uncomfortable. Elena noticed an older couple exchanging glances when Ashford raised his voice about the placement of his silverware. A family with teenage children went quiet when he loudly criticized the restaurant's choice of background music. "This is what's wrong with American dining," he announced, not caring who heard him. No attention to detail. No understanding of atmosphere. They play this generic jazz when they should be playing Vivaldi. Something with class. His companions laughed dutifully. though the younger man's laugh sounded forced. Elena was refilling water glasses at the next table when she heard Ashford's voice again, louder now. He'd had several glasses of wine and it was showing. "Did you see that violinist at Carnegie Hall last Tuesday?" he was saying to the woman. "Absolutely dreadful. I wrote that she played like she'd learned from YouTube tutorials. Her technique was sloppy, her interpretation was pedestrian, and her stage presence was non-existent." "That was a harsh review, Victor," the woman said, though she was smiling. "Harsh?" He laughed. It was honest. These young musicians today, they think passion is enough. They think because they feel something they can play, but feeling isn't technique. Emotion isn't skill. That girl had no business being on that stage. Elena's hands tightened on the water pitcher. She remembered reading that review. The violinist had been 23, fresh out of conservatory, and it was her debut performance. Ashford's review had been brutal, mocking not just her playing but her appearance, her background, even her choice of dress. The young woman had posted an apology on social media afterward, saying she was taking a break from performing to reassess. Elena wondered if that woman would ever perform again. She wondered if Victor Ashford cared. As the evening wore on, Ashford became louder and more boisterous. More wine flowed and his voice carried across the restaurant. He told stories about the famous musicians he'd destroyed with his reviews, seeming to take pride in each one. He name-dropped constantly, making sure everyone knew about his connections, his influence, his importance. Elena cleared their appetizer plates and brought the main course. As she was setting down Ashford's plate, her hand trembled slightly from carrying the heavy tray and she had to adjust her grip. It was barely noticeable, but Ashford noticed. "Careful there," he said loudly. "I'd hate for you to drop that. Though I suppose that's what insurance is for, right?" He laughed at his own joke. Elena's face burned, but she kept her expression neutral. "Is there anything else I can get for you, sir?" "Not unless you can get me better company," he said, gesturing at his companions. The younger man looked mortified. The woman rolled her eyes but smiled. As Elena walked away, she heard him continue. "That's the problem with these places. They hire anyone. No standards anymore." She made it to the kitchen before she let herself take a deep breath. Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the weight of the tray. It was anger. Pure, simple anger. Carlos saw her face. "What happened?" "Nothing," she said. "Just a difficult table. The guy in the center? The loud one?" "Yeah. Want me to spit in his food?" Carlos asked, grinning. Elena couldn't help but smile a little. "Don't tempt me." She took a moment to compose herself, then went back out. The night was far from over, and she still had 3 other tables to manage. But her eyes kept drifting back to Ashford's table, watching him hold court like a king among peasants. After the main course, Elena brought the dessert menus. As she approached, she had to pass by the piano in the corner. It was part of the route from the kitchen to Ashford's table, unavoidable. As always, her eyes lingered on it for just a moment. Just one brief second where she looked at those keys and remembered what it felt like to create something beautiful. But that 1 second was enough. Well, Victor Ashford's voice cut through her thoughts. "What's this? Does our waitress have an appreciation for fine instruments?" Elena turned to face him, the dessert menu still in her hand. "I'm sorry, sir." "The piano." He gestured toward it with his wineglass. "I saw you looking at it. That longing look." He turned to his companions with a grin. "I suppose everyone fancies themselves a musician these days, don't they?" The woman laughed. "Victor, leave the poor girl alone." But he was warming to his topic now, energized by wine and his own sense of superiority. No, I'm curious. Tell me, Elena Martinez, do you play?" The question hung in the air. Elena felt every eye at nearby tables turning toward her. This was the moment she should laugh it off, make a joke, deflect. That would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But something in his tone, something in the way he'd said, "I suppose everyone fancies themselves a musician," triggered something deep inside her. All the frustration of the evening, all the years of swallowed dreams, all the times she'd walked past that silent piano while serving people who'd never know what they had. "I did play, sir," she said quietly. Once, Victor Ashford's grin widened. He'd found new entertainment for the evening. "Oh, really? Where did you study? YouTube University?" His companions laughed. Elena's jaw tightened. "Juilliard actu?" Ally, the laughter stopped. Ashford stared at her, then burst out laughing even louder. Juilliard. Oh, that's rich. And now you're here serving pasta. How the mighty have fallen. Or should I say, how the mediocre have found their appropriate level. Something inside Elena cracked. She stood there, still holding the dessert menus, while this man who knew nothing about her life, nothing about her sacrifices, nothing about the music that still lived in her heart, mocked everything she'd once been, and in that moment, Victor Ashford made a decision that would change everything. He stood up from his chair, swaying slightly. You know what? I want to be entertained. You claim you went to Juilliard? He spoke loudly enough for the whole restaurant to hear. Then prove it. Play something for us. The restaurant went completely quiet. Even the kitchen noise seemed to fade. Elena felt her heart hammering in her chest. I can't, sir. I'm working, and the piano isn't for— Oh, I insist. Victor Ashford interrupted, his voice taking on a cruel edge. In fact, I'll speak to your manager. I'm sure he'd be happy to allow it. After all, I'm a valued customer. He was already gesturing toward Mr. Peterson, who was hurrying over with a concerned expression. Elena watched her boss's face as Ashford explained what he wanted. She saw Mr. Peterson's hesitation, then his nervous glance at her, then his slow nod. Of course, Mr. Ashford. Elena, you may use the piano. Just for a moment, Elena stood frozen. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to walk away, to maintain her dignity. But she also knew what would happen if she did. Ashford would complain. Mr. Peterson would be angry. She might lose her job, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. She was trapped, and Victor Ashford knew it. He sat back down with a satisfied smile, ready to watch her fail, ready to laugh at the waitress who dared to claim she went to Juilliard. The entire restaurant watched as Elena slowly walked toward the piano, her legs feeling like they were moving through water, her hands, calloused from years of carrying trays instead of playing music, trembled as she approached the instrument she'd walked past 1,000 times without touching. She was about to sit down when Victor Ashford's voice rang out one more time. You have 1 minute before I have you fired for wasting everyone's time. Make it count, sweetheart. Elena closed her eyes and took a breath. Then she sat down at the piano bench for the first time in 3 years. Elena's hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them. The piano bench felt foreign beneath her, even though she'd sat on benches just like this thousands of times before. But that was in another life when her hands belonged to music instead of serving trays. The restaurant was so quiet she could hear her own breathing. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back. Somewhere behind her, Victor Ashford was probably smirking, already composing the cutting remarks he'd make when she failed. She could imagine his voice, and see, I knew it. Another delusional nobody with impossible dreams. Her fingers trembled. 3 years. It had been 3 years since she'd played anything more complicated than Happy Birthday on her mother's old keyboard at home. 3 years since she'd felt the weight of real piano keys beneath her hands. 3 years since she'd been the person she was supposed to be. What was she even thinking? She couldn't do this. Not anymore. The muscle memory was probably gone. The technique she'd spent years building had likely faded. She'd embarrass herself in front of all these people, prove Victor Ashford right, and lose her job in the process. But then something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the exhaustion from working double shifts. Maybe it was the accumulation of 3 years of swallowed pride and abandoned dreams. Maybe it was simply that she had nothing left to lose. Whatever it was, Elena felt something rise up in her chest. Not confidence exactly. More like defiance. If she was going to fail, she'd fail spectacularly. If Victor Ashford wanted a show, she'd give him one. She took a deep breath and let her hands fall to the keys. The first touch sent electricity through her fingers. The keys were perfectly weighted, responsive in a way that her cheap keyboard at home had never been. This was a real piano, a professional instrument. Even just resting her hands on it felt like coming home after a long journey. Elena closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she wasn't wearing a waitress uniform anymore. She wasn't in Bella Vista with its expensive paintings and dim lighting. She was back at Juilliard, in one of the practice rooms with the afternoon sun coming through the windows. She was 24 again, preparing for her junior recital before everything fell apart. What should she play? Victor had given her 1 minute, which meant she needed something that would make an impact immediately. Something technically demanding enough to prove she wasn't lying about Juilliard. something beautiful enough to silence the room. The choice came to her without thinking. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, the third movement. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, requiring not just technical skill but emotional depth. It was also the piece she'd been practicing the day her mother collapsed. The piece she'd never gotten to perform. Her fingers found the opening notes almost by instinct. The first chord rang out through the restaurant, strong and clear and absolutely certain. Elena didn't play tentatively or apologetically. She played like she'd never stopped. Like the last 3 years had been a brief intermission and now the real performance was beginning. The notes came faster, her right hand dancing across the upper register while her left provided the driving bass line. Rachmaninoff had written this concerto as a journey from darkness into light, and Elena poured every ounce of her frustration, her grief, her anger, and her longing into those keys. Her hands remembered. God, they remembered everything. The way to lean into certain chords for emphasis, the precise touch needed for the softer passages, the explosive power required for the dramatic sections. It was like her fingers had been waiting 3 years for this moment, storing up all the music she hadn't been able to play. She forgot about Victor Ashford. She forgot about the restaurant and the watching crowd. She forgot about the bills waiting at home and the medical debt that never seemed to shrink. She forgot about being tired and having sore feet and feeling small. There was only the music flowing through her like a river that had finally broken through a dam. The piece built in intensity. Her whole body moved with the music now, swaying and bending as her hands flew across the keys. Sweat formed on her forehead. Her breathing came faster. This wasn't just playing. This was releasing 3 years of everything she'd been holding inside. In the audience, people had stopped eating entirely. Forks hung suspended halfway to mouths. Wine glasses sat forgotten on tables. A woman near the front had tears streaming down her face, though she probably didn't even realize it. The family with teenagers all stared with identical expressions of awe. Even the staff had stopped working, drawn out from the kitchen by the sound of something they'd never expected to hear in this place. Carlos stood in the kitchen doorway, his mouth hanging open. He'd worked with Elena for 2 years and had no idea. None of them had known. At his table, Victor Ashford's smirk had vanished. His face had gone pale and his wine glass sat forgotten in his hand. The woman beside him had stopped pretending to look amused. She was leaning forward, completely absorbed. The younger man with the portfolio had pulled out his phone and was recording, his hands shaking slightly. Mr. Peterson stood near the host stand, his carefully maintained composure completely shattered. He'd had a Juilliard-trained pianist working in his restaurant for 3 years, walking past his expensive showpiece piano every single shift, and he'd never known. Never asked, never wondered. Elena played on, lost in the music. The piece demanded everything from her, every bit of technique she'd learned, every emotion she'd suppressed. Her fingers moved so fast they blurred. The sound filled every corner of the restaurant, and it felt like the very air was vibrating with it. She reached the climactic section, where the composer had written notes that seemed impossible for human hands to play, but Elena had played them before, years ago, and her hands remembered the pathway. The music swelled, powerful and overwhelming, building to a crescendo that felt like her heart was breaking open, and all the light she'd been holding inside was finally pouring out. Then, just as suddenly as it had built up, the music softened. The final section of the piece was quiet, almost gentle, like the calm after a storm. Elena's hands moved with delicate precision, each note placed with perfect care. She could feel tears on her cheeks but didn't stop to wipe them away. The music was carrying her now, and she just had to follow it to the end. The final notes came, soft and fading, like a whisper of something beautiful that was about to disappear. Elena played them with such tenderness that several people in the audience had to wipe their eyes. She held the last note, letting it ring out and slowly fade into silence. Then she lifted her hands from the keys. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. The silence in the restaurant was absolute, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Elena sat at the piano bench, her hands still trembling, not quite able to believe what had just happened. She'd done it. After 3 years away from serious music, she'd just played one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire, and she'd played it well. She'd played it the way she used to, maybe even better, because now every note carried the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she still hoped for. Then the applause started. It began with the woman who'd been crying, who stood up from her table and began clapping with such enthusiasm that her jewelry jingled. Then the family joined in, the teenagers whooping and cheering. Within seconds, the entire restaurant was on its feet, applauding so loudly that it sounded like thunder. Elena turned on the bench, startled by the intensity of the response. People weren't just clapping politely. They were giving her a standing ovation. The older couple near Ashford's table was applauding with tears in their eyes. A young couple at the back was whistling and cheering. Even the staff was clapping, Carlos the loudest of all. She looked at Mr. Peterson and saw him applauding too, though his expression was complicated, like he was seeing her for the first time and realizing he'd been blind. Then Elena's eyes found Victor Ashford. He wasn't applauding. He sat perfectly still in his chair, his hands resting on the table, his wineglass forgotten. His face had gone through a series of transformations during her performance, from smug anticipation to shock, to something that looked almost like pain. Now he just looked stunned, like someone had hit him over the head with reality. His companions were clapping enthusiastically. The woman was saying something to him, her eyes bright with excitement, but he didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at Elena with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even embarrassment, though he should be embarrassed for what he'd done. It looked more like recognition. Like he was finally seeing her as a person instead of a waitress. Like he was finally understanding what he'd almost missed. What he'd almost destroyed with his careless cruelty. Elena stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. She didn't know what to do. She'd never performed for anyone but music students and professors and her mother. She'd certainly never received a standing ovation in a restaurant full of wealthy strangers who'd been expecting nothing more than a good meal. She managed a small bow, her hands clasped in front of her, and the applause somehow got even louder. "Brava!" someone shouted from the back of the restaurant. "Incredible!" called out another voice. A businessman at a corner table was dabbing his eyes with his napkin, not caring who saw. His wife was clutching his arm, still clapping, her face glowing. Elena caught sight of Carlos, who was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. He gave her 2 thumbs up, and she couldn't help but smile back, even though she was crying. Mr. Peterson was making his way toward her, though whether to praise her or fire her for the spectacle, she couldn't tell. But before he reached her, someone else moved. Victor Ashford pushed back his chair and stood up. The restaurant gradually quieted, people noticing his movement, curious what the famous critic would do next. He'd been the one to force her to play, after all. He'd been the one to mock and humiliate her. He walked toward Elena with slow, deliberate steps. His face was still pale, his expression unreadable. The entire restaurant watched him approach her, the tension suddenly palpable again. Elena stood by the piano, her heart racing for different reasons now. She'd proven her point. She'd shown him exactly what he'd tried to mock. But she also knew who Victor Ashford was. His power, his influence, his ability to destroy people with his words. He stopped a few feet away from her, and for a long moment he just looked at her. Really looked at her, the way you'd look at another human being instead of a servant. Then Victor Ashford did something that nobody in that restaurant, least of all Elena, expected. He began to clap. Slowly at first, each clap deliberate and measured, then faster, until he was applauding just as enthusiastically as everyone else. And as he clapped, his expression shifted into something that looked almost like shame. The restaurant erupted into fresh applause. People cheering not just for Elena's performance now, but for this moment of redemption, this small piece of justice in an unjust world. But Elena barely heard it. She was still staring at Victor Ashford, at the famous critic who'd tried to break her and had instead given her back something she thought she'd lost forever. She'd proven she could still play. After 3 years away, after countless double shifts and aching feet and swallowed dreams, she could still create something beautiful. The music hadn't left her. It had just been waiting. The applause finally began to fade, though people were still talking excitedly, turning to their companions with animated expressions, reliving what they'd just witnessed. Elena stood near the piano, feeling strangely exposed now that the music was over. Playing had been easy, natural. But standing here as herself, as a waitress who'd just revealed a hidden life, that was harder. Victor Ashford stopped clapping but didn't move away. He stood there studying her face like he was trying to memorize it. Up close, Elena could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his hair at the temples. He looked older than he had from across the room. He looked tired. He started, then stopped. For perhaps the first time in his life, Victor Ashford seemed at a loss for words. He cleared his throat and tried again. Where did you learn to play like that? Elena's hands were still trembling from the performance. She clasped them together to steady them. I told you, Juilliard. No, I mean... He shook his head, frustrated with himself. I know you said Juilliard. I just didn't believe you. I thought... He trailed off, and she could see him struggling with what to say next. You thought I was lying. Elena finished for him quietly. You thought I was some delusional waitress with impossible dreams. The words hung between them. Victor flinched like she'd slapped him, but he didn't deny it. That at least earned him a small measure of respect in Elena's eyes. He wasn't making excuses, yes, he admitted. That's exactly what I thought. And I was wrong. Profoundly, inexcusably wrong. Other diners were starting to approach now, wanting to congratulate Elena, but Victor held up a hand. Please, give us a moment. His voice carried enough authority that people actually stepped back, though they lingered nearby, waiting their turn. He turned back to Elena, and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected. Genuine curiosity mixed with something that looked almost like remorse. How does someone who plays like that end up working here? I don't mean that as an insult. I truly want to understand. Elena felt her defenses rising. What right did he have to ask her personal questions? He'd spent the whole evening treating her like she was beneath him. But then she looked at his face again and saw that he was really asking. Not as a critic gathering material for some cutting observation, as a person trying to understand something that didn't make sense. Can we sit? She asked, gesturing to an empty table nearby. Her legs still felt shaky from the performance, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand. Of course. Victor pulled out a chair for her, a gesture that seemed to surprise them both. His companions remained at their original table, watching with obvious interest. They sat across from each other, and Elena took a moment to gather her thoughts. How did you explain the collapse of a dream in a way that made sense? How did you tell someone about choosing between your future and your mother's life? I was in my final year at Juilliard, she began. Full scholarship, piano performance major. I had it all planned out. Graduate, start auditioning for competitions, build a career. My professor said I had real potential. She smiled sadly at the memory. That feels like a different lifetime now. Victor leaned forward slightly, listening intently. It was strange seeing him like this, focused and serious instead of mocking and dismissive. My mother worked as a nursing assistant at a hospital in Queens, Elena continued. She raised me by herself after my father left when I was 6. Every sacrifice she made was for me. Extra shifts so I could have piano lessons. Going without so I could attend music camps. She never complained. Never asked for anything back. She could feel tears threatening but pushed them down. She'd cried enough for one night. During my final year, she had a stroke at work. Massive. The doctors said if her co-workers hadn't been right there, she probably wouldn't have survived. Elena's voice caught slightly. She lived, but the recovery was long. Months of physical therapy, medications, follow-up appointments. Even with insurance, the bills were overwhelming. Victor's face had gone very still. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the silence with empty platitudes. I tried to do both, Elena said. Stay in school and take care of her. I worked part-time, practiced at night, went to classes exhausted. For one semester, I almost pulled it off. But my playing suffered. My grades dropped. I was on track to lose my scholarship. She shrugged, trying to make the gesture casual even though the memory still hurt. So I made a choice. I withdrew 2 months before graduation. 2 months, Victor repeated softly. 2 months, Elena confirmed. I was so close. But my mother needed me and the bills kept coming and someone had to work full-time. So I found this job. It paid better than anywhere else I interviewed. And I've been here ever since, 3 years now. She looked down at her hands at the calluses that had formed from carrying trays instead of playing piano. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd save up and go back. But the debt never seems to shrink. My mother can't work full-time anymore, so I support both of us. And going back to school. finishing that degree, performing professionally. It all seems impossible now, like a dream I had once that doesn't fit my life anymore. The words felt heavy in the air between them. Elena had never told anyone the full story before. Not Carlos, not Mr. Peterson, not even her mother knew how much Elena grieved for the life she'd given up. Victor was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I have spent my entire career judging people, reviewing their performances, their technique, their artistry. I've built a reputation on being able to spot talent, to separate the truly gifted from the merely competent. He met her eyes. And tonight I looked at you and saw nothing but a waitress. I judged you on your uniform and your accent and the fact that you were serving my dinner. I didn't see your talent. I didn't see your sacrifice. I didn't see you at all. He ran a hand through his silver hair, a gesture that made him look almost vulnerable. That violinist I reviewed last week, the one I destroyed in print, she was 23. It was her debut performance. I wrote that she had no business being on that stage, that she should go back to practicing instead of wasting everyone's time. He laughed bitterly. I never wondered what her story might be, what she might have overcome just to get to that stage. I just saw her mistakes and felt entitled to mock them. I read that review, Elena said quietly. It was cruel. Yes, it was. Victor didn't try to defend himself. I told myself it was honesty, that I was doing a service by maintaining high standards. But really, I think I just enjoyed the power, the ability to make or break someone with my words. He looked at her directly. What I did to you tonight was worse, though. At least that violinist knew the performance would be reviewed. You were just trying to work, to earn a living, and I turned you into entertainment. I humiliated you because I could. Elena didn't know what to say. She'd expected many things from this conversation, but not this level of honest self-reflection. Before she could respond, the businessman who'd been crying earlier approached their table hesitantly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just had to tell you. He was speaking to Elena, his eyes still red. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. My daughter played piano. She died 2 years ago. Car accident. She was only 19, his voice broke. She used to play Rachmaninoff. That was her favorite composer. Hearing you play tonight, it was like getting a piece of her back for just a moment. Thank you. He walked away quickly, and Elena felt tears spill down her cheeks. She hadn't known. When she was playing, lost in the music, she hadn't known that someone in the audience was hearing his daughter's voice in the notes, that her music was touching something deeper than just entertainment. More people came over. The woman with the bright eyes who'd started the standing ovation, the family with teenagers, whose daughter asked shyly if Elena gave lessons, the older couple who told her they'd been coming to this restaurant for 15 years and had never heard that piano played, a young man who said he was a music teacher, and would she consider performing at his school. Each person had been moved by what she'd played. Each person saw her as a musician, an artist, someone worthy of respect and admiration. Not a waitress who'd gotten above her station, not someone who should be grateful just to have a job, but as someone with real talent and real value. Mr. Peterson appeared at her elbow looking uncomfortable. Elena, can I speak with you for a moment? She excused herself from the table and followed him a short distance away. She braced herself for whatever was coming. Maybe he was angry about the disruption. Maybe he was going to fire her after all. I had no idea, he said simply. 3 years you've worked here and I never asked. Never wondered. You were just efficient, reliable. I didn't see past that. Elena waited, not sure where this was going. I'd like you to play every Saturday night, Mr. Peterson continued. During dinner service, not as a waitress who also plays, but as our pianist. It would be a different position, different pay. Better pay, he added quickly. People clearly respond to live music, and after tonight word will spread. This could be very good for business. It was a job offer, a chance to play regularly, to earn money doing what she loved instead of carrying plates. A few hours ago, Elena would have been overjoyed, but now something felt wrong about it. Let me think about it, she said carefully. Mr. Peterson looked surprised but nodded. Of course, take your time. Elena returned to the table where Victor was waiting. He'd been watching the whole interaction, and something told her he'd heard what Mr. Peterson said. You should take it, Victor said. The chance to perform regularly, even in a restaurant. It's better than not playing at all. Maybe, Elena said, but it's not what I really want. What I really want is to finish my degree, to perform in actual concert halls, to be taken seriously as a musician, not as dinner entertainment. She met his eyes. What I really want is the life I had to give up. Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled a business card from his wallet and wrote something on the back. This is my personal number. Call me tomorrow. There's something I want to discuss with you. Elena took the card, confused. What kind of something? A possibility, he said. I can't promise anything, but I have connections. People who might be able to help. I know some board members at Juilliard. I know directors of scholarship programs. I know venue managers who are always looking for new talent. He stood up from the table. What I did tonight was unforgivable. I can't take it back, but maybe I can do something to make it right. Elena looked down at the card in her hand. Victor Ashford's name was embossed in elegant script, and his personal number was scrawled on the back in black ink. It felt surreal, like she'd somehow stepped into a different version of her life. Why would you help me? She asked. Victor smiled sadly. Because tonight you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that behind every person serving you coffee or parking your car or taking your order, there's a whole story you don't know, a whole life full of dreams and disappointments and impossible choices. You reminded me that talent exists everywhere, even in places people like me never think to look. He picked up his coat from the back of his chair. And because that violinist I destroyed last week deserves better from me, and so do you. He started to walk away, then turned back. That performance tonight, that was world class. You belong on stages that matter, and if I can help make that happen, it's the least I can do. Elena watched him return to his table, say something to his companions, and leave cash on the table for the bill. As he walked toward the exit, several diners nodded at him and he nodded back. But the arrogant swagger he'd arrived with was gone. Carlos appeared beside Elena, grinning. So you're kind of a big deal, huh? Elena laughed, the sound surprising her. I guess so. For tonight anyway. For tonight, Carlos agreed. But something tells me this isn't over. Elena looked down at the business card in her hand, at the phone number that might represent a doorway back to the life she thought she'd lost forever. No, she said softly. I don't think it is. Elena stared at Victor Ashford's business card for 2 days before she called him. She kept it in her apron pocket at work, pulling it out during quiet moments to make sure it was real, that the night had really happened, that the famous critic had really given her his personal number and talked about helping her. Part of her worried it had been empty words. A wealthy man's guilt that would fade as soon as he sobered up and went back to his regular life. People made promises all the time that they didn't keep. Why should Victor Ashford be any different? But another part of her, the part that had played Rachmaninoff in front of a restaurant full of strangers, the part that still believed in possibilities, whispered that maybe this time was different. Maybe this one time someone with power would actually follow through. On Monday afternoon, before her evening shift started, Elena sat on a bench in Central Park and dialed the number. He answered on the second ring. This is Victor, Mr. Ashford. This is Elena Martinez. From the restaurant. Elena. His voice warmed immediately. I was hoping you'd call. I was starting to worry you wouldn't. They talked for over an hour. Victor explained that he'd spent the weekend making calls, reaching out to people he knew in the music world. He'd contacted the director of Juilliard's scholarship committee, who remembered Elena's name and was shocked to learn she'd never graduated. He'd spoken to the coordinator of a program that helped musicians in financial hardship complete their education. He'd even reached out to a colleague who ran a small concert series and was always looking for emerging talent to feature. I can't promise any of this will work out, Victor said honestly. These things take time and there are no guarantees. But I wanted you to know that I'm serious. I meant what I said about helping. Elena felt tears prickling at her eyes. Why are you doing this? Victor was quiet for a moment. Because Saturday night you gave me a gift. You showed me something beautiful at a moment when I was being my absolute worst. You had every right to refuse, to walk away, to tell me to go to hell, but instead you sat down at that piano and created something transcendent. He paused. I've been